Hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Williams, your host for the Organic Theologians podcast. I'm sorry it's been over a month since the last time we put a podcast out, but it's been a little busy here. Hopefully, we'll be getting more on track for a more regularly based podcast. Let's go ahead, though, and get started on into episode 3. Last time on Organic Theologians, I talked about the need for better communication skills among today's Christians. If we're truly are desiring to resolve the issues of the church today. I would like to start out this episode by making more clear for those who may think that in my last episode, my promotion of communication by incorporating more active listening is implying that one does not need to anchor their necessary practices and decisions of everyday life in what one believes is truth at the current moment and must detach themselves from their pre-existing responsibilities and commitments and wander off into the wilderness in search of it. This is impractical and unbiblical in more than one way, which I will not go into right now, for that's not the purpose of this episode. But to not take time to verify one's truths that they live by as objectively as possible is a dangerous practice. That is the mode of life that leads people to join in the building of concentration camps and willingly drinking poison Kool-Aid. We all are programmed with a narrative that has its own set of truths that has been mediated to us by our culture. But when one enters into the family of God, a new mediation of truth begins. It is mediated by the community of faith struggle with the Scripture and Spirit. Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Knowing the Messiah's truth for each cultural situation we run into is not always known to us at the very moment, so we must pursue Jesus in that moment. For he has the truth because he is the truth. And beings, if you have heard from him, then you have heard from the Father, because he only says and does what the Father's will is. Then by the way of logic, you are also doing God's truth. I am of the same persuasion as John Wesley, that the pursuit for God is a never-ending love affair, and therein a never-ending pursuit of truth. Within the phrase, pursuit of truth, lies the implication that one does not possess it, and therein must be pursued. But what about the truths we live by that we don't pursue? This implies we possess those. But one must ask, did I subject those presupposed truths to the proper litmus test? Without such testing, how is one to be fully confident in that truth or truths? All that being said, there's no reason why one cannot carry out their daily duties with their presupposed truths while actively verifying them. And this mode of truth pursuing can be done while incorporating active listening into their verification process. This is a collective effort of the Spirit and the believer. It is also referenced as progressive sanctification. Now, for those who may think I was being ungracious in my last episode to the older in the church, is because I have observed a problem that inhabits the elderly who have grown up in this industrial Western world. The industrial machine has been vigorously built because of its promise to lead to the good life. And yes, it was limited to the few who had the means in the beginning, but now it has spread its wealth more broadly, giving those with inferior bloodlines and limited education a piece of the pie. The secular pursued it purely for economic gain, and for those more religious that were taught that gaining the world would put them in jeopardy of losing their soul, comforted their pious consciences by downplaying their rising pay rate as a byproduct of their God-given abilities, which were being put to good use in building this economic machine. For them, it was a way out of the lower class and direct indication of God's blessing of the nation they lived in, a land flowing with milk and honey. It was here that the church began to restrict their pursuit for truth to the boundaries of the God-blessed industrial machine, and the biblical interpretation of community was mostly ignored or reworked beyond historical recognition. This industrial-informed hermeneutic was the mode of truth pursuing that the clergy of this time began to incorporate. And for those who were not as ambitious as these who rose to the level of clerical leadership during this time era, but were subjects of their clerical guidance which incorporated biblical truths that were derived by these inadequate methods, are implicated just as well in bearing these ideologies. Having this generation in mind is why I mentioned in the previous episode that it will be hard for the older to sit down at such talks. They will find it hard to believe that the church communities that their fathers and grandfathers helped to develop could have played a part in this deteriorating situation. And surely the practices of the past will be scrutinized at the table. This is why I mentioned the hindrance of age-related cognitive changes, which according to current medical research makes learning slower for most other older people, thereby making them less likely to listen to new possible truths which will require more time to learn due to this slowing of the mind. Mixing this with the egotistical idea that I could not have got it wrong this long, therein makes them less likely to come to the table incorporating active listening skills. And for a lot of older people who have seen themselves as leaders above correction, to even entertain the idea that their theology could have flaws is to them to state that their whole life has been incorrect and a failure. But this is not the character trait of those who are pursuers of truth. For those who are pursuers of truth, develop an acute awareness of their ability to be incorrect. It is this awareness that brings them to the table of criticism to actively listen, so that those truths he or she holds may pass through the criticism, either tearing down or legitimating it. And the more of these tests it endures, the weaker or stronger the truth will become, letting one know when they need to let go or hold on to that truth. But one left alone without the community of faith, but claiming to incorporate the Spirit to develop truth, is using an inferior method, which is usually an indication of an overly individualistic person, non-communal, and therein unbiblical. To summarize, we must carry on our everyday lives with our presupposed and unpresupposed truths, but never assume that they are above questioning whenever challenged, always accepting our humanity as a possible compromising factor in the development of those truths. If this was the practice of the pursuit of truth / pursuit of God in everyday life of the young, middle-aged, and old, there would be no asking to come to the table, only the problem of trying to find a place to sit. This crowded table is one of the signs of the community of God, which is the topic I would like to focus the rest of this episode on. Growing up in eastern Tennessee, attending the Church of God of Cleveland, and living in a township that was a missional outreach of the Methodists, which was started in the early 1900s, with Baptist churches sprinkled throughout, I heard the many different theological viewpoints that were most common in the Bible Belt of America. But as I began to study the Scripture more closely, I encountered the subject of community in contrast to the early church's communal practices, forcing me to struggle with forming some sort of synthesis of practice between the early church and the current church's cultural communal practices. Sermons on community were spoken from the pulpit when I was younger, but in most of those sermons, the background that informed a proper community structure was based off of early American church life, or if there was a mention of the first century church communal practices in contrast to the 20th century American church communal practices, it mostly consisted of mentioning of the need to be more readily prepared to sacrifice one's life unto death, as the early church members did, and this was driven by the increase in Christian persecution that had risen in the 20th century in third world countries. But there was never any detailed teaching or conversation on what was the proper mode for our modern church communities in comparison to the early church, and even why it was necessary. This knowledge was not expounded upon because it was near non-existent, and the reason for this is that it was seen as unnecessary or contrary to the current cultural structures in our evangelical conservative churches. This silencing or indifferencing towards early church history as concerning community among the conservative churches of America can be linked to the close relationship between American politics and the conservative church. In James Davis Hunter's book, To Change the World, Hunter statistically expounds upon the right-wing conservative party's substantial and long-running influence on American legislation. I and others believe it is because of the influence of the overstating of personal salvation that found its impetus in the Reformation, hence sparking a more individualistic focus that had integrating compounds of the Enlightenment mixed in with it that were antithetical to the early church's communal life, that in varying degrees influenced the philosophers of the 17th and 18th centuries, whose philosophy influenced the founders of America and its politics, that led to this lack of focus on any serious investigation into the question of how much and in what ways should the first century church community be our model. One of the reasons for this is because of the tension in the early church between the Jew and Gentiles that Paul so passionately fought to alleviate. It's seen its full separation come to pass somewhere in the 3rd to 4th century. and then for 1,000 years plus left the Jewish background of Jesus and the apostles that informed a proper interpretation of their writings in the dark. And it hasn't been until the last few decades that we have really started to understand how important this historical background information of Second Temple Judaism is to proper interpretation of the New Testament. So, with the relationship between church and state in America being derived from an Augustinian/Reformation theology of Paul, which subsequently informed the Gospels, and devoid of proper understanding of Second Temple Judaism, it's no wonder the right-wing evangelicals of the United States have found it easy to hold hands with the overly individualistic ideologies that are contrary to the communal life of the first century church. It was their own uninformed theology that helped shape it, and even with this enlightening scholarship that has been presented in the last 50 years, the right-wing evangelicals have responded by engaging in questionable interpretations of history and somewhat deceiving polemics. A great deal of scholarship today has been unpacking the historical background that informed Jesus and Paul's structuring of the early church communities, which helps us today find fresh ways to approach the problem that our Christian communities are facing. This unhealthy mixture of American nationalism and Christianity that abides in our fundamentalist evangelical conservative churches has made it near impossible to have any constructive dialogue. They over-spiritualize the community of faith's existence so they can underemphasize its active reality in their concrete daily practices. This is the method of easing their conscience that is necessary to make them able to ignore the truth that there is no world government in existence that the biblical meta-narrative is able to coincide with. In doing this, their conscience may be unhindered by the overly individualistic demands of their consumer culture. I agree with Gerhard Lohfink, where he says in his book Jesus and Community, quote, Jesus sought not only to express an inner attitude, but also to address concrete practices within new social order. Jesus understood the people of God which he sought to gather as a contrast society. This in no way means that he envisioned the people of God as a state or a nation, but he did understand it as a community which forms its own sphere of life, a community in which one lives in a different way and treats others in a different way than is usual elsewhere in the world. We could definitely describe the people of God which Jesus sought to gather as an alternative society, unquote. I have been, and I think anyone else would be hard-pressed to find biblical support for the overly individualistic character that seems to inhabit the mind of the Western culture. Just not even from a biblical standpoint is excess individualism unsupported, but also modern psychological research is giving credibility to the need for more energy to be spent toward learning how to have real meaningful social interaction that I believe can be found in the New Testament. The prestigious Tulane University wrote in an internet article, quote, that in early 2024, the American Psychiatric Association's Healthy Minds Monthly Poll revealed that 30% of American adults felt lonely at least weekly over the past year, while 10% reported feeling lonely every day. Younger adults were particularly vulnerable, with 30% of those aged 18 to 34 saying they feel lonely daily or several times a week, unquote. But other respected psychological research centers, such as the American Psychological Association, shows that older adults are also at a higher risk of social isolation. In their internet article posted in May of 2019, stating the risk of social isolation, quote, according to 2018 national survey by Cigna, loneliness levels have reached an all-time high, with nearly half of 20,000 U.S. adults polled reporting they sometimes or always feel alone. 40% of the survey participants also reported they sometimes or always feel that their relationships are not meaningful and that they feel isolated, unquote. The article goes on to speak of the health risks that are involved with the social isolation, saying, quote, according to a meta-analysis co-authored by Julianne Holt-Lundstedt, Ph.D., a professor of psychological and neuroscience at Brigham Young University, lack of social connection heightens health risk as much as smoking 15 cigarettes a day or having alcohol use disorder. She's also found that loneliness and social isolation are twice as harmful to physical and mental health as obesity. There is robust evidence and social isolation and loneliness significantly increase risk for premature mortality. and the magnitude of the risk exceeds that of many leading health indicators, unquote. Throughout this article, they differentiate between social isolation and loneliness, which I agree with this differentiation. This was not mentioned in the earlier article I referenced by Tulane University. I mention this just to bring to awareness that there are several things to take into consideration when trying to understand these matters. One must do their homework when analyzing the information that has been put together by these psychological institutions. How conclusive of a picture one can draw from all the reports out there is up for discussion, but one does find it hard to deny the most recent U.S. Census data that Amy Novotny states in the latter article I mentioned. Quote, more than a quarter of the population lives alone, the highest rate ever recorded. In addition, more than half of the population is unmarried, and marriage rates and the number of children per household have declined since the previous census. Rates of volunteerism have also decreased, according to the research by University of Maryland's Do Good Institute, and an increased percentage of Americans report no religious affiliation, suggesting declines in the kinds of religious and other institutional connections that can provide community. Regardless of whether loneliness is increasing or remaining stable, we have lots of evidence that a significant portion of the population is affected by it, says Holtz-Lundstedt. Being connected to others socially is widely considered a fundamental need, crucial to both well-being and survival, unquote. This fundamental need to be socially connected in meaningful ways is the nature of being human, and the depth of that connectiveness in humans is the consequence of being made in the image of God. The lack of proper communication that I mentioned in the previous podcast that is plaguing our ability to unify is nothing less than the inferior genetics received by the breeding of discord that led to the severing between the Jews and Gentiles around the 3rd to 4th century, producing a child whom the reformers were betrothed to, and unwittingly passing on the inferior genes to our current modern churches, wherein we are experiencing one of the diseases these inferior genes produces, Western individualism. Some symptoms are social isolation and loneliness due to the lack of community in the body. To try to simply put it, most of our churches don't know about the community formations of the early church, and they're doing the only thing they know to do, and that is to form communities according to the evangelical fundamentalist theology, which in reality is pseudo-community because of the communal destructive individualism found throughout its formation in the Western world. Everything I've talked about in these 3 podcasts up to this point will never be taken serious until the question of what should a biblical community look like is taken serious. This is one of those questions that needs addressing at the table, but the disease has had its damaging effect, leaving the people of the church in a state of delusion, believing they are in accordance with biblical community, therein making any discussion on the topic irrelevant to them. So then we must break through this wall if we're going to make any headway. Thank you all for listening. Leave your comments in the box, and until next time, be careful out there.